So there have been these kind of two events that you've referenced. An anti-abortion bill introduced quite out of the blue in South Australia, and then Robbie Katter, an independent MP in Queensland, suddenly announcing that if the LNP are elected at this Queensland election, which they had been widely expected to do, he would immediately move to introduce a bill to completely repeal that state's decriminalisation of abortion, which was only 6 years old. So the two events, on the one hand, aren't explicitly connected, but I do think they speak to this kind of broader climate of energised and emboldened anti-abortion activism and politicians taking note of that and trying to capitalise on it.
Is there any way that this has anything to do with the cultural import, say, from what's happening in America at the moment? American politics, very much driven by the issue of reproductive rights, especially in the lead up to the US elections.
I think that it's more a matter of direct influence. So during decrim, we did see moments where anti-abortion leaders from the US actually did come into, for example, in South Australia, some of them visited Parliament and talked with politicians. We haven't seen any evidence of that in this moment. So the influence here is much more about the strategies, tactics and rhetoric that's happening in the US, all of which I think we are seeing replicated quite crudely here, particularly in the kind of comments that have come out from people around later abortion in South Australia. Most of that is verbatim from what we see in US debates.
All right. Well, I was interested in reading that a recent Labor-friendly poll of about 1,000 Queenslanders found that a majority were pro-choice. I wonder if that is actually reflected across Australia.
Yes, Australians have consistently for decades been very pro-choice. It's normally estimated at being actually closer to about 80% of Australians identify as pro-choice. And there's lots of data and polls going back, certainly to the start of the 21st century. It's worth noting, though, that a majority of Americans have been pro-choice for decades as well. And that really didn't make a difference there in terms of Roe v. Wade falling.
If one state or territory in Australia was to recriminalise abortion, shall we say, do you see other states or territories following suit?
Well, on the one hand, the only place where that seems likely, and I say that with great hesitation, is Queensland, primarily because of its unicameral system. So in Queensland, you have only one House of Parliament, and you also have a Liberal National Party in Queensland that is essentially an anti-abortion party and has been certainly for the last 6 years. And no matter what their leader, David Crisafulli, is saying, the party is the party is running multiple very vocal anti-abortion new candidates this election, including Amanda Stoker, who some might remember from the Morrison years. So in Queensland, there does seem some possibility that there'll be some kind of wholesale attack on abortion rights in Queensland. In other states, it's more complicated. I think we're more likely, largely because of those bicameral systems in most states, that if abortion rights gets revisited, it will be in trying to push down or create limits about when abortion can no longer be provided.
Yeah, I did wonder whether, banning abortion is one thing, but perhaps tweaking abortion legislation or abortion laws might be another thing too, perhaps even putting some sort of limitations on the gestation termination. Do you see that happening down the line?
I absolutely think that we will see more anti-abortion efforts to change the laws. That's what's happened in South Australia and was only narrowly defeated. And some of the key architects of that have said, that they're not giving up because they were defeated. They'll just wait till the next term. And they've made it clear that their goal is for abortion to be unthinkable.
Right.
And in some ways,
I find that, apologies for interrupting, but I find that interesting too, because we saw that too decades in the lead up to Roe v. Wade being overturned in the US.
Yes, exactly. And I was going to say that is actually also a key right-to-life strategy from the US. So American activists repeatedly failed to ban abortion in the US. They tried for 49 years. The Supreme Court upheld abortion in multiple significant decisions. They couldn't get a constitutional amendment through. So what they did instead was work on reducing rights, reducing access, focusing heavily on statistically rare abortions that happen after 20 weeks gestation. And that's dominated the way that abortion has been spoken about for decades. Think only of the way that Donald Trump always talks about abortion as, quote unquote, happening up to the minute of birth.
Right. Now, abortion, all right, so abortion may be legal across Australia. How would you characterise access to the procedure, particularly, in regional, rural areas?
That is such an important question, and I'm really glad to see people kind of not just making this discussion around what anti-abortion people say. Access in Australia is not great. There have been consistent studies that if you don't live in a city, a major city, you do not have easy access to abortion. Only a few days ago, a Victorian study indicated that 40% of Victorians don't live in a region where they can even access medication abortion, which is the earliest forms of abortion. And, you know, I think it's quite important to note that abortion is also very expensive in much of the country. There's only in South Australia, ACT and Northern Territory is it publicly provided. And so what you see is that many people who need to access abortion don't have it near them and have to pay a huge amount of money out of pocket to do so. And that's, given that Australia has now moved to treating abortion as healthcare, that is a deeply shameful situation.